I'm Dr. Nancy Beck-Young, and I'm the director of the Center for Public History, and it is my pleasure to welcome you tonight. At the Center for Public History, our mission is to ignite an understanding of our diverse pasts by collaborating with and training historically minded students, practitioners, and the public through community-driven programming and scholarship. Since 1984, we have created collaborative research projects with university and community partners to generate research that is local and global. As public historians, we are committed to doing history for and with the communities of which we are a part. We do this in three ways. First, we train graduate and undergraduate students in public history methods, values, and ethics, and prepare them for careers in the public humanities. Second, through public-facing projects like Houston History Magazine, scholars, students, and community members work together to document our rich community histories. And third, through public programming under the CPH Lecture Series, we strive to make history matter in Houston by sponsoring lectures, workshops, discussions, and seminars that speak to the value of the humanities in the professions and the public. Tonight's event is in collaboration with the Sharing Stories from 1977 project, which is a flagship digital humanities project in the Center for Public History. Sharing Stories tells the history of the 1977 National Women's Conference, which drew almost 2,000 delegates and alternates to Houston in November 1977 to determine what women wanted from the federal government. Barbara Jordan was the keynote speaker for that conference, so it is only fitting that we gather tonight to hear from Professor Mary Ellen Curtin about her new biography of Jordan. Mary Ellen Curtin is a historian of modern African American and women's social and political history. Her first book, Black Prisoners and Their World, Alabama 1865 to 1900, investigated the origins of the convict leasing system in Alabama and explored the lives of Black convict coal miners and their communities after emancipation. Her latest book, She Changed the Nation, Barbara Jordan's Life and Legacy in Black Politics, came out earlier this year. It examines the life and significance of Texas Congresswoman Barbara Jordan, the first Black woman from the South elected to Congress. Dr. Curtin served as a consultant for the PBS documentary, Slavery by Another Name, A History of African Americans and Forced Labor in the South. She is an amazing historian, and we are in for a treat. Dr. Curtin.
Thank you so much. Well, I can only say that I am so pleased and excited to be here. I'm so grateful to Dr. Nancy Beck-Young for inviting me to come and for introducing me to the amazing work that's being done here in Houston. I had such an enjoyable lunch with the faculty who are all engaged in Houston history, and I have so much to learn from the people here still. It is such a rich history in Houston, and I feel very kind of humbled to contribute to this story. I'm not from Texas. This was all very new to me. It took me a long time to put this story together, but it was really worth it. I feel that our understanding of Jordan is perhaps just too superficial, and that we're sort of content just to see her as like a great American and not really dig more deeply than that. But there's a lot more to her story, and I want to share some of that with you tonight. So here's the cover of my book, Barbara Jordan, and I call her an insurgent Southern Black woman Democrat. And I got that word insurgent from one of my professors in graduate school. I was fortunate enough to attend Duke University, where I met and learned a lot from another Texan, a historian, an activist by the name of Larry Goodwin, who wrote a path-breaking book on populism. And Larry taught a course that examined the populists, the union organizers, and the civil rights activists who battled the region's economic and racial oppression. And he called it the insurgent South. And so this evening, I do claim that adjective of insurgent for Barbara Jordan, who in 1966 became the first Black woman elected to the Texas State Senate and then in 1972 was elected to represent Houston in Congress, becoming the first Black woman from the South ever elected to that chamber. Now, she retired from that office in 1978 to teach at the LBJ School of Public Affairs, where she continued public service and Democratic Party politics. Born into segregation in 1936, Jordan died in 1996 at the age of 59, a woman who became known for being the first and for breaking many barriers. And I think those are important achievements. But despite these radical achievements, I think that Jordan has been portrayed first and foremost as a kind of mainstream politician, an eloquent Black woman, to be sure, with a booming voice, who broke barriers, but whose achievements as an inspiring first, in a way, is used to kind of validate the nation that she actually criticized a great deal. And monuments such as these, I think, in the baggage claim of the Austin airport really fail to capture Jordan's significance as a Black leader with two big goals. First, to organize Black voters into a political force in the Democratic Party. And second, to use that party as an instrument to achieve social and political equality and to make the ideals of the civil rights movement real. So those are her two main goals. And so today I'm going to trace Jordan's political career and I think pause at particular moments that I think help to shine some light towards the end, a little bit about where we are today. Look forward to a robust discussion about all kinds of things related to politics. And at the end, I'd like to reflect more on Jordan as a woman, as an individual woman, and the personal traits that I think will inspire the next generation of leadership. So since emancipation, you have to remember that the Democratic Party in the South had stood for segregation and white supremacy. So if you think about it, it's quite a dramatic shift to go from that to having someone like Kamala Harris as a nominee for the president, and certainly the Obama presidency. But when Jordan was growing up, the leaders of the party stood for white supremacy and the exclusion of Black voters from politics. But between 1960 and 1966, Jordan joined forces with the so-called Democratic Coalition in Texas to upend that conservative control of the Texas Democratic Party. She was a product of segregation. She attended Phyllis Wheatley High School, Texas Southern University. She was a champion debater of the TSU team, trained by Black teachers such as Dr. Thomas Freeman. And then went on to law school at Boston University, where she learned not so much about public speaking, but about thinking, how to think rigorously and how to think in a way that you can be persuasive and logical. So she often talked about law school as an experience that brought her up short, because she said, they didn't care how I could orate. They wanted to know how well I could think. And so it really did have an enormous impact on her. She also, though, encountered other important Black thinkers at the time, such as Reverend Howard Thurman, who had an enormous influence on her. His take on religion really helped her understand the importance of faith in her life, even though she didn't necessarily subscribe to traditional Baptist beliefs. So if any of you have questions about her faith or religion, again, please, you feel free to ask me those questions when we have our discussion. But she was also an effective community organizer when she returned to Houston. She comes back to Houston after law school, the age of 23. Jordan is quite young when she achieves everything that she does. And at that very young age, she led voter registration efforts. She worked for the Kennedy campaign. And then after that campaign is finished, she is a leading voice against school segregation in Houston, and also a leading voice against the poll tax in Texas. She ran for the Texas House in 1962 and 1964, and finally won a seat in the Texas Senate in 1966. Through her activism and political campaigns, Jordan created an effective and powerful network of black workers, mostly women, but not solely, but largely women, who were her block workers. These were people who went door to door to educate others about the vote. And their support of her brought out the black vote for other liberal Democrats at the time, most of whom were whites. But Jordan believed, as did Bayard Rustin, that building a coalition with organized labor and liberals and other minority groups ultimately did serve black interests. However, she insisted that black voters within this coalition should be represented by black candidates. And this was a bold idea at the time. Now, so you have to understand that black voting in Houston has a longer history than we normally associate with the South. In the 1940s, and most of you probably already know this, black voting really became an integral part of black political culture because of a particular case called Smith v. Allwright. Now, what that case was about was challenging the so-called white primary that had excluded black people from the Democratic Party. So there's many different ways that people were disenfranchised and kept out of the political process. In Texas, one of the most effective ways was this white primary system. Many people could pay their poll taxes and vote in the general election, but they couldn't vote in the one election that mattered, which was the primary race. That was the race where the candidate was chosen, all right? So how do you get into the system? How do you become part of the Democratic primary? Well, you have to change the law so you can join the party. And that's what Smith v. Allwright was about. Since 1940, black Houstonians, led by this gentleman, this is a picture of Albert A. Lucas, who was president of the Texas NAACP in the 1940s, but he was also the minister at Jordan's church, the Good Hope Missionary Baptist Church, which is still quite an important force in Houston today. But Lucas really anticipated, in other words, the close relationship between church attendance and church organization and voting. And so he forges this relationship in the 1940s. And as head of the Texas NAACP, he supports Thurgood Marshall and the nationwide NAACP's efforts to overthrow this law called the white primary. So local black churches in Houston raise money and support the plaintiff. This is a long story in and of itself. Dr. Lonnie Smith, who was a Houston dentist and also a member of Good Hope Missionary Baptist Church, in this extraordinarily important Supreme Court case. And through his support of Smith, Lucas boosted NAACP membership in Houston and spurred black Houstonians to, quote, risk belief that they could change the trajectory of the Democratic Party. And it's quite extraordinary when you think about it, because it's really like saying we can turn this party to our purposes. It doesn't have to be the party of white supremacy. If we can win this decision, if we can join the party, if we can have a say in its primary, things can be different. So the popular campaign to end the white primary set the foundation, really, for the 1950s and 60s, where you have other achievements in Houston, such as the election of Mrs. Hattie Mae White to become the first African-American to be elected to Houston School Board, and black students from Texas Southern who engaged in sit-ins at local businesses. And more Houstonians became involved in voting for candidates endorsed by this Democratic coalition, the liberal wing of the conservative Democratic Party. But I think the organizing effort, the independent organizing effort of the black churches to defeat the white primary is a story that is an essential part of understanding this coalition, because without it, you wouldn't have the most important leg of this coalition, which was the black vote. And here's a quote from an NAACP organizer talking about Reverend Lucas, and you can see the close connection here between faith and politics. I am telling my friends of the two-fisted Houston preacher who on the last day of the campaign had NAACP memberships lying beside his Bible on his pulpit, symbolizing the fact that he places the physical welfare of his people beside their spiritual salvation. So this was an extraordinarily important Supreme Court decision, and it really, you have to think about it as a social movement in Houston. These court cases, right, they seem so dry when you read them, but we don't really get the human dimension of the movement that was behind them, and that was certainly true of this case, Smith v. Albright. So since the 1960 Kennedy campaign, Jordan had been part of this liberal coalition, and she drew in Black voters. And so, everyone at the time really comments on her ability to go into a church or go into a community meeting and inspire people to go out and register other folks to vote. And, in 1960, Kennedy won Texas. This was, without those electoral, we all know how important those electoral votes are. This was an extremely close race. No one expected this. And, it's sort of talked about with Lyndon Johnson on the ticket. But the Black turnout in Houston, along with other Latinos, really pushed Texas over for Kennedy. And Jordan always felt very proud of the role that she played in that victory. And so after, working with this Democratic Party in the coalition, and so I think, we think of sort of party politics as a kind of opposed to activism. But again, in Houston at this time, in Texas at the time, the two were really quite linked. You had a lot of activists. People saw their an important part of activism was challenging segregation and challenging what the Democratic Party stood for, and they thought they could make those inroads from within through elections. So as Jordan spoke out against school segregation and led local efforts to overturn the poll tax, she became an even a more well-known figure in Houston in the early 60s. Again, still as a very young woman, because she ran for a seat in the Texas House twice in 1962 and 1964, and she lost both times. But in 1966, she was victorious in her primary race, and she finally gained a place in the Texas Senate, and her political career was launched. Now, we have to, I think, pause here and step back and look at this 1966 victory more closely. So why did she lose in 62 and 64, but not in 66? And the answer to that is we have to look carefully about this thing we call disfranchisement. There are many ways and forms of disfranchisement, and keeping people off the voting rolls or out of the primary are just two ways. But there are other ways, and those other ways didn't go away, right? So you have something called malapportionment, right, where rural Texas has far more power in representative government than urban Texas. So for the Texas Senate, you had one state senator to represent all of Houston, 1 million people, right? And one state senator for a few thousand people in rural Texas. That's called malapportionment. And the Supreme Court ultimately said that is unconstitutional. But it was only those series of court cases that led to that decision was controversial, and it was something new. So I want to have you listen. I know we've all heard clips of Barbara Jordan, but I want to have you listen to one particular speech that she gave, which I don't think many of you have perhaps heard before. And this is where she is recounting sort of her own story of how she was able to win in politics because of the intervention of the Supreme Court. And this is testimony she gave to oppose the nomination of Judge Robert Bork to the Supreme Court. This was in 1987. So I want you to hear this in her own words, how she explains it.
Writings, but more than mere that, my opposition to this nomination is really a result of living 51 years as a Black American, born in the South and determined to be heard by the majority community. That really is the primary basis for my opposition to this nomination. I concede Judge Bork's scholarship and intellect and its quality, and there is no need for us to debate that. But more is required. When you experience the frustrations of being in a minority position and watching the foreclosure of your last appeal, and then suddenly you are rescued by the Supreme Court of the United States. Mr. Chairman, that's tantamount to being born again. I had that experience. The year was 1962. I had graduated from Boston University Law School in 1959. I went back to Houston, Texas with my law degree in hand, and the Democrats around there said in 1962, your work with us since you've been here makes us think you ought to run for the Texas House of Representatives. I said, but I have no money to run. They said, we'll loan you the money. And so on a borrowed $500, I filed for the election to the Texas House of Representatives. I ran. I lost. But I got 46,000 votes. I was undaunted. I said, I'll try that again, because I think my qualifications are what this community needs. So in 1964, I ran again for membership in the House of Representatives of the state of Texas. I lost, but I got 64,000 votes. Why could I not win? I'll tell you why. The Texas legislature was so malapportioned that just a handful of people were electing a majority of the legislature. I was dispirited. I was trying to play by the rules, and the rules were not fair. But something happened. A decision was handed down. Baker versus Carr. That decision said this: the complaint's allegations of a denial of equal protection present a justiciable constitutional cause of action. The right asserted is within the judicial protection of the 14th Amendment. Following Baker versus Carr, a series of cases were decided. The Texas legislature was required, mandated by the Supreme Court to reapportion itself. It reapportioned, so in 1966 I ran again, third time. This time in one of those newly created state senatorial districts. I won. And my political career got started. You know what Judge Bark says about those cases on reapportionment? He has disagreed with the principle of one person, one vote many times. In his confirmation hearings in 1973, this is what he said: I think one man, one vote was too much of a straitjacket. And then he continued, I do not think there is a theoretical basis for it. My word. I do not think there is a theoretical basis for it. Maybe not, gentlemen. Maybe there is no theoretical basis for one person, one vote, but I'll tell you this much. There is a common sense, natural, rational basis for all votes counting equally. We once had a poll tax in Texas. That poll tax was used to keep people from voting. The Supreme Court said it was wrong, outlawed it. Bork said the case was wrongfully decided. You have talked much about the right of privacy. Griswold, Thoreau, and others. Judge Bork has his theory. If you can't find that right within the letter of the Constitution explicitly, it's not there. It doesn't exist. I believe that the presence of that point of view on the Supreme Court of the United States places at risk individual rights. It is a risk we should not afford. We don't have to. I like the idea that the Supreme Court of the United States is the last bulwark of protection for our freedoms. Would the membership of Judge Bork alter that altogether? I don't know whether that's the case, but that is not the question. I don't want to see the argument made that there is no right to privacy on the court. I don't want that argument made. And the only way to prevent it being made is to deny Judge Bork membership on the court.
Lot there. And Judge Bork wasn't confirmed, you know? So, but there's we can talk more about her testimony, but for me, you know, to hear her explain the importance of those decisions for her own success really is important, because we, again, so often just think, oh, she, you know, won on the third, she just kept trying, and on the third time, it worked. No, as she says later in this testimony, she could have kept running and running and running, and without that decision, she would never have won. It wasn't going to happen. And so she said, I cannot abide that, gentlemen, right? So, victory, 1966, you know, in the Texas Senate, this newly created single-member district. But again, I think I just want to pause here to just remind you about, as she says, these other methods designed to stop Black voters from electing their own representatives. And this is really what she stood for. Poll taxes she talked about. The cost of running for office, right? $500? Yeah, that's, you know, just to file. It's expensive. And then this thing called multi-member districts that were later overturned also by court decisions, and because they unfairly discriminated against minority candidates. This is where Jordan was running at first. You have Houston, 1 million people, but only the top vote getters get in. Well, with somebody, you know, it would be impossible for a minority to exert any kind of influence in that race without some kind of reapportionment. So there's lots of ways to dilute the voting power of Black voters. And we see it, and there's many ingenious ways, and this was happening all over the South, not just Texas. And as I said, she makes it, the way she explains it, makes so much sense, right? Common sense, reasonable thing to do, and to protect individual rights. And you have to make sure that the rules and the process are fair. It's not enough just to say, oh, come and vote. Well, people vote all over the world. Like, people vote in autocratic, and people vote in Russia, okay? Like, it doesn't mean they have power, right? You have to make the vote meaningful. And Jordan's insight here is that without the change in the rules, the vote was not as meaningful as it could have been and should have been. This was true all over the South. I don't mean to single out Texas. So you have to look at things. In 1965, there were 36,000 state and local elected officials in the former Confederacy. And of those 36,000, only 72 were Black. And none of them were in state houses. So when we say she was the first, I mean, really, not just in Texas, but one of the first in the whole region. 72? This is the state of things in 19. And so if the harm is directed at a group, the Supreme Court and others have said, the remedy also has to take into account group interests. And that's what happened with the Voting Rights Act. So even after the favorable decision called Kilgarlin v. Martin, if you're interested, that reapportioned the Texas Senate and created a district that she could actually win, Jordan faced further opposition, this time not just from segregationists, but even within the Democratic coalition. So even after this decision, I went ahead and showed her with the victory sign, but there was conflict even as she ran for office. She gained her seat in the Senate only after defeating a liberal white male opponent in a primary race. Okay, so now she's got a district she can win. But then she's got a challenger, a white liberal, Charlie Whitfield. He's like, hey, what about me? I want to be in the Senate. I've served in the Texas House. Why don't you vote for me? And he made this argument that he told black voters that it was racist not to vote for him. So in the course of that primary race, Jordan learned that black candidates and communities had to fight for political representation, even within their own coalitions. In this campaign, she put her headquarters on Lyons Avenue in the 5th Ward. She organized block workers who went door to door, showing people how to vote and telling them where to go and when. To be a Jordan block worker was to be an agent of political education and social change. There's no other way to put it. And with the help of political scientist Dr. Wilhelmina Perry, the first black woman to receive a PhD in sociology from the University of Texas at Austin, Jordan's campaign focused on data analysis, block workers, voter education, really basic grassroots strategies. The black vote doesn't just come, she told Julian Bond in an interview. It has to be brought out and it has to be organized. The battle, in other words, Jordan's battle had to be fought on many fronts. Her district had a substantial number of white voters, but convincing them to come over to her side proved much harder than she had anticipated. After all, she's supposed to be in a coalition. After her first 2 defeats, a white political scientist in that coalition told her that it was going to be difficult for her to win. And this is why, he said, he didn't bring up disfranchisement. He brought up something else. He said, you're a black, you're a woman, and you're large. People don't really like that image. Now, this is not the last time that Jordan would hear references to herself as representing a certain stereotype that I'm going to put in scare quotes here, but it's mammy. And that word is used to describe her in the press and in journalism more often than you might think. It's there. And it's often used by liberal presses. So Jordan had, in theory, the endorsement of white labor leaders, but she still had a white liberal opponent in this race. And her opponent accused her of voter fraud. And in what the Texas Observer called a grim turn, this opponent, Charlie Whitfield, stated that if black voters did not vote for him, they would, quote, fail the test of racism. Now, white voters, on the other hand, were not accused of failing any test in refusing to vote for Jordan, right? But even with all of these, all of her support, it was hard to know, right, who was ahead. We don't have like the polling that we have today. Many people considered this race a toss-up. She really didn't know. But at the end of that campaign, Jordan answered Whitfield's attempt to discredit her with a proud, racially conscious theme that perfectly reflected the feelings of her constituents. Our time has come, she said at a public rally. For the past 20 years, black voters had supported white candidates and sent liberal white legislators to represent them. Now Jordan urged black voters to seize the day. Can a white man win? I say to you, no, not this time. And Jordan crushed him. She crushed Whitfield. She received 98% of the black vote in her district, and she did well enough with white voters too, but the black turnout for her was so large
that she only needed 12 white votes to win the race. So after her victory, her emotional campaign workers sang a civil rights medley, including We Shall Overcome. We needed a victory, Jordan stated. This is the only way. We've been talking a long time. But they always come back and say, we don't see anything. A victory in the State House will do more to help the Negro recognize his voting strength than anything I can think of. On the day that Jordan was sworn in to the Texas Senate, James Stanley, a retired Black teacher, called Jordan, quote, the most beautiful woman in the world and a symbol of all Negro womanhood, showing the contrast between how the Black community perceived her and how many other white liberals in that coalition perceived her. Because of the Black church, the Black schools, the unions, the press, all united around her and contributed mightily to this victory. The New York Times ran her photo, and it seems that the tide of Black Southern voting for the Democratic Party had enthusiastically begun, and we still see it today. So Jordan served in the Texas Senate for 6 eventful years between 1966 and 1972. And during this time, she joined forces, indeed, with other male liberals in the Senate. She fought for the traditional liberal causes, fair taxation, and a corporate profits tax. But she also successfully opposed bills designed to freeze, thwart, and reduce voter registration. That never goes away. There's always somebody trying to say, oh, you have to re-register, you have to pay the, always some impediment coming up. And she very forcefully opposes those measures. She learns a lot. She learns how to establish relationships and how to talk with her adversaries. But Jordan was still deeply involved in broader efforts to push Black interests in civil rights. Her achievement as a Black senator gained national attention, and she traveled widely. She spoke all over in the North and South in this time. She's not just in Texas, and sometimes even alongside Martin Luther King Jr. At SCLC conventions and in other places. You know, not a lot, but I found, several times when they knew each other, and he appreciated her oratory, which just says a lot. But after his 1968 assassination, Jordan did not remain silent. And I wanted to give you just one example of a speech that she gave to a white audience. She confronted a white audience on the deleterious effects of racism on Black lives shortly after the King's assassination. At a newspaper and media convention in Austin in May of 1968, Jordan spoke to the owners and executives of the major white newspapers and radio and television stations in the state. And this crowd of white elites and businessmen heard Jordan lay out Black frustration with the slow pace of political change in the nation. According to the Black press, the Forward Times, she, quote, held the pack house spellbound as she spoke for over an hour. She talked about the failed promise of the American Revolution and the Constitution. Quote, the real question which now arises is, did anybody believe these promises of America? Were the spokesmen of this country serious? I submit that the Negro believed and that white America could not risk belief. She quoted Black psychologist Kenneth Clark about the deleterious effects of racism on mental health, and she asked the audience, have you ever questioned the extent of your own contribution to the perpetuation of this kind of system? Do you, in your contacts with minority people, serve their further dehumanization? Can you define the promise of America? And if you define it, can you help make it real? The excluded, she said, quote, become tired of empty promises, meaningless phraseology, exploitation, and intimidation. They become tired of 1,000 blatant and subtle indignities heaped upon their heads and stored in their gut 1,000 different times on 1,000 different days. Jordan offered a blunt assessment. Prejudice and discrimination based on race has produced a society which she says has a cancer built into it. Palliatives and Band-Aids cannot cure the ills. Black Americans, said Jordan, want America to hear him. She used the male pronoun. You will save this country if this country does this. Oh, Black Americans, said Jordan, wants America to hear him, understand his condition, and support his humanity. If this country does this, it will save him, and you will save this country, and you will save yourselves. Jordan's readiness to confront a white audience with their own complicity in perpetuating inequality on every level, from the institutional to the personal, astonished the Forward Times, which noted that an almost instant mood of acceptance fell over the white audience. She wrapped up her masterpiece of oratory by demonstrating, it said, how the person listening to the sounds from the Negro community was the one to be concerned about and not the one making the sounds. Jordan could make those who had never experienced oppression understand it and understand their own role in perpetuating it. So her efforts to upend the conservative control of the Texas Democratic Party continued, and she remained central to those struggles the whole time she was in the Texas legislature. But another redistricting effort created a new 18th congressional district for Houston. An election to the House of Representatives placed her in the orbit of conservative Texans who wielded great power in Washington. And she began to pursue her second goal, to make the Democratic Party the instrument for social change. And after she won the race that would send her to Washington in May of 1972, Jordan served as governor for a day. And so here's what we see here up on the screen, and expressed her hope for what she could achieve in Congress. I want us to be able, she said, to translate all of the rhetoric of our time, the promise, the dream, into truth and fact. She asked her audience to, quote, stand behind me and help me move this nation. She made the day a celebration of Blackness in Texas. Throughout the day, you had bands from all these schools in the Fifth Ward performing on the grounds. You had Black artists inside the Capitol. It was I don't want to say a takeover, but she really inserted Black people and Black culture and Black children into that space and claimed it, declaring this sickle cell anemia day and things like that. So this is a symbolic day, but she made it into more than that. It was a kind of envisioning, right, of what the future could be. And so before she made the day a celebration, as I said, of Blackness in Texas and quoted the Bible, she said to her audience, I leave this word with you. It doth not yet appear what we shall be. Before she went to D.C., Jordan was well known among national Black leaders. She worked with Julian Bond and Mrs. King to forge alliances between liberal elected officials and Black activists. She attended the National Black Political Convention in Gary, Indiana, where she served as chair of the Resolutions Committee, which is a whole nother story that I talk about in my book. Disagreements led to walkouts at that convention and splits between activists and Black politicians, but Jordan remained in Gary for the duration. And she took up her seat in Congress the following year. Her first 8 months in Congress show an outspoken Jordan who pushed against the establishment while also working with it, and she quickly emerged as a leader. In April of 1973, the freshman class in Congress chose Jordan as their spokesperson. So for not just the Black Congressional Caucus, the whole freshman class chose her as their spokesperson. And on the House floor, she attacked Speaker Carl Albert, a Democrat, right, stating, the inability of the Democratic majority to decide on a course of action and to move on it as an articulate, responsible opposition party has caused a deep sense of depression, not only among freshmen, but among some of the most senior members of Congress, she said. And she denounced President Nixon for breaking up the Office of Economic Opportunity, which was the linchpin of President Johnson's war on poverty. In May of 1973, she and George McGovern debated Republicans before a gathering of the American Society of Newspaper Editors. She stopped her Republican opponent short by asking, I just want to raise this one question. Why are we dropping bombs on Cambodia? Jordan's question flustered Ann Armstrong, who was a special counsel to Nixon, and Caspar Weinberger, and drew applause. And throughout the night, she denounced President Nixon's, quote, one-man rule and lamented that, quote, the The poor, the old, the defenseless are being lost in a shuffle of papers. Throughout 1973, she called for Nixon to be impeached, and this was even before Watergate. So her quick wit and her candor impressed all. She especially delighted in championing Black women. So the 15 Black representatives in Congress in 1973, this was the largest number ever, and it included another Southerner, herself and Andrew Young, but also the first cohort of Black women. This is very important. It's not just Shirley Chisholm. Shirley Chisholm was the first, and she was the only Black woman for 4 years. But Jordan and Yvonne Burke and Cardis Collins, and you could think of them as sort of the original squad, I think. So in July of 1973, all 4 women appeared together before an audience of 2,000 for a panel hosted by the National Urban League on Black women in politics, where the friction, the politics among these 16 men and women of the Congressional Black Caucus became apparent. And here's a quote. Representative Barbara Jordan of Houston brought most of the women, white and Black, to their feet, cheering, screaming, and applauding when she said, "The message I have to my brethren, you are very good and bright and intelligent young men, but it is time for you to understand that power does not come from your extemporaneous rhetoric about the activities you engage in and the prowess you can exercise in relation to Black females and white females." Oh. 6 years as the only Black representative in the Texas, so that statement brought a lot of applause from the women in the audience. So 6 years as the only Black representative in the Texas Senate had forced often Jordan, I think, to hold back. But now that she's in Washington, she feels a lot freer. And following the applause, she said, "Where would you find 5 or 6 brighter women anywhere in the country than you have here tonight?" So I guess my point here is, again, I don't think Jordan is properly appreciated as a Black feminist. And so I have a lot in the book about that and her statements and her policies to that effect. And also I think people misunderstand the relationship between her and Shirley Chisholm, which is about mutual respect, actually. And at this point, Shirley Chisholm is kind of kind of has had it with having run for the presidency in 1972 and suffered so much criticism for doing that. And at this National Urban League convention, she ended her remarks by noting that she, yes, had indeed paved the way for others to follow, but if she chose to quit politics, she would leave things in the capable hands of people like Barbara Jordan. So Watergate is usually seen as the moment where a dormant and little-known Jordan sprang to life, but I think if Watergate had not happened, it's kind of an interesting thing to think about. What would Jordan's trajectory have been? And it could easily have taken a very different course in which she would have led the charge of more liberal Democrats in Washington. So here she is with Andy Young. And here's also a picture of a very relaxed Jordan. And that is, I have other pictures, but that is her partner there, Nancy Earle, whose back is to her. And they are simply out in Williamsburg, Virginia at a conference. They're together. And this is in 1973 during her first year in D.C. These 2 women had met in Austin and had been partners since Jordan's time in the Texas Senate. They traveled together. Earle helped Jordan with her speeches. Eventually, she came to D.C. to work in Jordan's office. They had a relationship for over 20 years. They shared a house together in Austin. Their relationship was something of an open secret, and you can kind of see that in some of these photos that you can see and other photos that are in the Jordan archives. Jordan was definitely enjoying her life, I think, in Washington. But after the Saturday Night Massacre and the firing of Archibald Cox, however, her life changed dramatically. In the spring and summer of 1974, when the Judiciary Committee went into isolation to consider the evidence to impeach Nixon, Jordan withdrew from the fray among Democrats and the CBC to focus on the question of impeachment. And we know her for her persuasive speech supporting Nixon's impeachment. But behind the scenes, within that committee, I think she played an even more important role in creating a bipartisan consensus. So her close relationship with committee chair Peter Rodino led her to pursue a course of action that sought to forge a bipartisan consensus behind the articles of impeachment. And here in this time, she's much more cautious about impeachment. You don't hear Barbara Jordan calling for Nixon's impeachment when she's on the Judiciary Committee. She holds back her fire and waits until that that moment, public moment in July. So, and you can see this in other, people talking about what it was like to be on this committee. For example, when the committee listened to the Nixon tapes and heard President Nixon using extremely racist slurs against minorities, it debated whether to release those tapes to the public, decided not to. Now, Charles Rangel, who was a former prosecutor, a black representative from New York, said we should use these tapes as a bargaining lever against the Republicans on our committee to get them to agree to different things that we want. But he said he remembered Barbara Jordan speaking very seriously said that would be a mistake and we would live to regret it. So in retrospect, Rangel agreed that you had to adopt a different sort of tactics in order to gain consensus because the public would not have accepted the committee's decision if it was all Democrats voting for impeachment and all Republicans voting no. You had to have a bipartisan committee, and Jordan was absolutely committed to that. She became more circumspect in her public pronouncements about impeachment, but no less determined in her goals, as was clear during her televised speech during prime time in July of 1974. So in 1975, Jordan, along with other members of the Congressional Black Caucus, turned her attention to legislation. And again, this is an achievement of hers that not many people are aware of, but she was the driving force behind the language of the new and expanded 1975 Voting Rights Act. This was a crucial piece of legislation that extended that initial act for 7 years and expanded its reach to include language minorities, a risky yet important achievement with enormous consequences for decades to come, including the decades we live in now. Against much opposition in her home state and among Southern conservative Democrats, the Voting Rights Act of 1975 was passed, and Texas was finally included in it because of this language provision. Texas was not originally included in the 1965 Voting Rights Act, or in 1970, but in 1975 it is, and it's because of her that Texas comes under that scrutiny. So, in 1966, think of what happened in 10 years, right? Jordan became the first black woman ever to serve in the Texas legislature. A mere 10 years later, here she is, the keynote speaker for the 1976 Democratic Convention. And her eloquence that night earned her over 20 standing ovations. For her unifying message, she was called the hero of the party. More importantly, she redefined what the party stood for: inclusion, opportunity, equality, the common good. My little light was shining again, remarked Donna Brazil, who heard Jordan's speech when she was a teenager in Louisiana. She credits Jordan with helping herself to imagine herself in politics, crucial to inspiring more black voters to see the Democrats as the party of change. Jordan became an important figure within the Democratic Party so quickly that she was often accused of being an insider, a mere acolyte of LBJ and other powerful leaders. But she went much further, particularly with her recognition of black activists and black women. So she's more than just LBJ. She goes much farther in her vision for what the Democratic Party should be and what it could achieve. So for some time, scholars have focused on how the civil rights movement transformed Southern politics by ushering in a realignment of the party system and a rebirth of the Republican Party, right, as a conservative institution. Nixon strategist and political scientist Kevin Phillips famously said, "The secret of politics is knowing who hates who," and predicted the shift of white voters to the Republicans. And yet, this focus on understanding the behavior of white voters who left the Democrats has prevented an understanding of what happened to the black voters who came. And in this crucial 10-year period between 1966 and 1976, new black voters and politicians joined the Democratic Party and emerged as prominent leaders. Jordan is an inspiring practitioner of coalition politics, and at the same time, she was a mobilizer of black voters and campaigners. She sought to forge a lasting relationship between black voters and the Democrats. Through nonviolent direct action and new federal laws, the civil rights movement cracked open the door to black political participation in the South, but it took black politicians such as Jordan to break down the gates and introduce a practice of multiracial democracy. As a Southern black woman, Jordan represented the group that had been most defiled and oppressed by slavery and segregation and disfranchisement. But like a phoenix, she rose from those ashes, and she became a leading force in politics and as she sought to erase the ghosts of Southern white supremacy in the Democratic Party. And she anticipated how Southern black women set the moral tone as well as the new foundation for this party. She spearheaded the first attempts of civil rights activists to push the ideals of the civil rights and feminist movement into formal politics. And for that alone, I think she belongs in the pantheon of Southern insurgents. But she was also bigger than that. She was something new. She was a champion of women in politics and a partisan Democrat, a public servant to the end, a person who believed in something called the common good. She possessed tremendous poise and self-discipline to accomplish her goals. Growing up in segregation, Jordan had to learn to, quote, keep the lid on her feelings and emotions. She talks about this all the time, how angry she was, but how she could never show that anger. She often was called cool, inscrutable, and as she told an interviewer, she had to really learn how to, quote, suppress her anger. She had been comfortable in the company of men since her days as a college debater, but she was a keen competitor who liked to win. And I think that picture of her playing poker is instructive because in politics, a woman had to be careful not to let her guard down and let a competitor see the cards that she held or see what she was thinking. She used a variety of methods to persuade those in power and her allies to support her goals. More than a token, Jordan entered politics to be a force of social change for her people and then to change the nation. To accomplish her goals, she had to turn her disadvantages into advantages. She was brave and she took risks, and she always insisted on living life on her own terms, regardless of criticism. When Joe Biden withdrew from the race, I was often asked about Kamala Harris running for office. And funny enough, at the time, I was kind of hesitant about it. I should have been enthusiastic. People thought, oh, you must be really enthusiastic about this. But I was hesitant. And some of my hesitation came from the knowledge I had of the sexism and racism that Barbara Jordan had endured as a candidate and as an individual, even among those liberals who should have been supporting her. What does this woman want was the headline of the Texas Monthly magazine after Jordan's great triumph in Madison Square Garden. She was always being accused of simply just being ambitious and selfish. And this article many articles are perpetuating negative, very distasteful images of Jordan's ambition, and they are often explicitly using racist and sexist images, including Mammy and Aunt Jemima. This is well into the 70s. These kinds of terms are being used to describe her. This was in 1976, and despite this amazing speech that was lauded all over the nation, Jordan was not called upon to be vice president. And she was denied a place in Carter's cabinet. He doesn't have her in her cabinet. So every major poll of the period named Jordan as the woman most likely to be president or serve on the Supreme Court. But it turns out we would have to wait another 50 years, and maybe now longer, for both of those things to happen. The prejudice against her, which she understood at the time, even with all of her popularity and strength, was simply too great. So I felt that was what Kamala Harris would face, but still she had to do it. And her defeat shows us perhaps how far the country, but the Democrats too, have to go when it comes to understanding how to use the power of race and sex and coalition politics to mobilize the majority. Jordan spent her life in that struggle, and I think she would want all of us to do that too. So, thank you.
We have about 15 minutes for questions, and I'm sure that you have many. This was an inspiring talk. Maria.
Jordan's kind of politics was very much pragmatic in the sense of knowing you have to talk to people to build
Yeah, so that's a really good question, and this is one of the things that her relationship, or her feeling about LBJ, is one of the things that really kind of divided her from other liberals in the Democratic coalition. So I interviewed Billy Carr, for example, who's a legendary, black activist, and she said, "I hated LBJ, but I voted for him every time. I hated him, but I voted for him, right?" So they didn't really appreciate that Jordan often join in on some of those rage, filled, but she did in other ways. I mean, she was alongside Billy Carr and others, for example, against John Connally. She hated John Connally. Barbara Jordan did. He was her nemesis, and he didn't like her either. And in the book, I talk about from like 1962 on, they have this thing. And she really does not like John Connally at all. He represents the conservative, voice and power within that within the Democratic Party. So I think, in a way, like you said, pragmatic. Whenever people would say, "Look what he's doing," he could have done more. He could have done this, especially the war in Vietnam. She says, "I am very aware of his limitations. I still think he was a great president." And she and Andy Young, you see, appreciate what he did for voting rights and what he did for black rights in a way that I think is hard for white liberals to understand. And so, I mean, her view was, well, your arguments with him are not my arguments, right? I have different things I want. I want to push him. And, you can even see like Julian Bond. It's quite interesting. Like Julian Bond is such an interesting figure because he, like Jordan, is also running for office. He was elected to the Georgia state legislature a year before she was. The difference was that you can see the white power structure, not to overuse a phrase, doesn't want to let him in, and they don't. And the reason they don't is because during a press conference, he was asked if he supported SNCC's position on Vietnam, and he said yes. He was accused of treason. They refused to seat him. He had to go to the Supreme Court. They let him do that. The judiciary let him do that. He sat there. He was never sworn in. He had to run for office again for one comment. These men are not playing games. They are not happy with integrating the political system and welcoming black representatives. And so every time you think, "Oh, well, she, went along, blah, blah," I really take issue with that, because the opposition that she is facing just in the primary race alone should give you a sense of how uncomfortable people felt with dealing with black politicians on an equal basis, and particularly black women. So she figures this out, and she figures out how to, getting along with people doesn't mean you kowtow to them. And the other thing that helps her enormously is that there is because of redistricting, there is a substantial group of other liberals that she can band together with in that session in 1966. So they can work together to try and get a corporate profits tax and fair taxation and block these terrible pieces of legislation and work together. So that also accounts for some of her efficacy. She didn't do it alone. But without that redistricting, those liberals wouldn't have been there either. So she understands, like, all right, these guys aren't perfect, but they're my best hope, right, to work with. So I hope that answers your question. Yeah.
Other questions?
Comments? Things that surprised you? Yeah. Mm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's more complicated than we know. Usually, if you're teaching a survey class, the answer is it all comes down to Franklin Roosevelt, right? So he's a Democrat, the New Deal, and because of the Great Migration, you had new black voters, right, coming from the South into the North, and they really appreciate Roosevelt's. Appreciate the New Deal. They appreciate Eleanor Roosevelt. And they appreciate opportunities within sort of Democratic Party machines, right? That if they vote, they will be rewarded, with some kind of political power at a local level. So there's some interesting books on this about sort of Roosevelt's role, right, as becoming an important symbol. So there's a book called Farewell to the Party of Lincoln that just focuses on Roosevelt and then argues that it all flowed from that, right? So once you get Roosevelt, then, 1948, the party platform, there's a civil rights bill in the party platform, but still the segregationists are part of this Democratic Party too, and Roosevelt has to take them into account, otherwise he won't get any New Deal legislation passed. And so it is a very uneasy coalition. And what's going to happen in the South is, unknown. But with really Lyndon Johnson and the Voting Rights Act, he understands that what this means is that you're opening the door for black voters to enter this party, to participate in the primary process, and he's afraid that whites are going to leave because they're not going to want to support it, and many do. But it happens more slowly than I think we acknowledge. In the 60s and early 70s, even the time she's running, there's a substantial number still of, it's not until 1980 really, that you've got this really big push into a new sort of conservative Republican Party, and that happens with even George Wallace is a Democrat. So the party's kind of trying to find its identity. You've got Shirley Chisholm and George Wallace running in primary races against each other, right? In 1972. Quite interesting. Like what does the party stand for? So they're trying to figure this thing out. So normally, short answer, it's attributed to Roosevelt and sort of a knock-on effect to that, but I don't really see how that works in the South. In Houston, it does a little bit. You've got black union members because of the black unions here. They appreciate Roosevelt, and so they become Democrats because of that. They're in unions, and he supports unions. But if you're not in a union, right, like you said, why? And the other reason is that actually Republicans in the South had kicked whites. It was something called the Lily White movement in the Republican Party. They had kicked black voters out and disfranchised them just as bad as the Democrats did. So they weren't really, quote unquote, wanted in either party. And so this is why the end of the white primary was so important. I think Lucas is kind of coming from the Roosevelt, energy a bit. But I think with the civil rights movement, it really took leaders like Jordan to get the black vote out and to say, hey, look, this is a party we can lead in as well as vote in. And so that's why I think she's such a key figure. Yeah.
Miranda. I think we're in a really interesting time in politics, especially right now. Kamala running for president, which was historic in and of itself. I am wondering, you so intimately know Barbara Jordan's political sense, how she thought, how she acted. What would she think of American politics today? And maybe what would be her advice for the future of the Democratic Party?
Yeah. Okay. I think I think Jordan, I tried to not use the word pragmatist. I think she's a strategic idealist, if that makes sense, right? So I think she keeps that. She's not for, like, you can see this with what she did with the Voting Rights Act, expanding. The safe thing to do, the pragmatic thing to do would just to leave it alone and just renew it and not change it. Don't go for this language provision. Don't go for including Texas. It's only going to cause more blowback. She got a lot of people were not happy with her for doing that. It was unexpected. She did it, right? So that was a bold move, but it was a visionary move. It's like, yeah, this coalition has to include people whose first language is not, has to include immigrants. It has to include language minorities and labor and et cetera. So on the other hand, when Jimmy Carter is the nominee in 76, she speaks for him and everything, and he gets elected. But she says pretty bluntly, pretty early on, he's not going to get reelected. The country's is becoming more conservative. It's not happening. And she says this in 1978. She said the country's moving to the right, people. And she really calls out Democrats for their complacency because they're thinking, we've always been in charge. We're both, we're in charge in Congress. Ha ha. They think they don't see it coming. She does actually. And she's like, they're making inroads. Republicans are making inroads in the South, and we've got to match them. And we have to reach out. She would say we have to reach out to these this is before the moral majority, right? She's like, why can't we? She reaches out. She speaks in white evangelical churches. They love her. She's got that faith-based, foundation. So I think she understands the coming wave and danger, and understands the importance of reaching out to, but she also understands the country's becoming more conservative, and that it's going to be much harder. So I don't think she'd necessarily be surprised, but, seeing the kind of intervention she did in the Bork hearings, she understands the danger, right, of having that kind of thinking on the Supreme Court. And she can only do so much as an individual. I mean, she'd been retired from Congress, for a good 10 years. And she's an activist to the end. I mean, she does all kinds of things at party conventions, and all kinds of things to try and put forward a more progressive kind of politics. And I think she would say you have to keep doing that, but you have to be strategic. And strategy depends on the moment. This is the other thing. I noticed, why did she do that? A lot of understanding why she voted a certain way or said a certain thing, you really have to look carefully at the context of the period. Because if it was a different time or period, she might have done it differently. I think she's very strategic and just thinking at that moment, how can I maximize my leverage? How can I maximize what I have? And keep my own sense of morals, high moral ground. So I hope that answers your question. Yeah.
Other questions? Elizabeth.
So, there's so many parallels between, I guess, every moment and every other moment. But what you described and what seems like it's happening in our moment, so that's 6 years ago.
Mm.
And one of the things that has struck me about the Dobbs decision was, and what happened after that, with the sort of 22 states that have restricted rights. Most of them are former Confederate states, and sort of recreating a divided nation where people have different rights in different parts, in different sectors.
Yeah.
So you're creating like a banned sector and a ban-free sector, which is based on gender in this case, as opposed to race. But there's a big parallel, and part of these dynamics seem to be ways of excluding people, and also people having gotten to a point where they actually were challenging. They were kind of tipping point where women were suddenly 28% of Congress, whereas in 1990 they were less than 6%.
Right.
So just the past 35 years, there's been this enormous shift, and it's been based on reliable birth control.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So people could put off their first birth until they finish their education. They're in a different situation completely, and they can be represented by women,
Mm-hmm.
not by people saying they're speaking for women. So you have this kind of tipping point dynamic, and you see this enormous pushback that, so the question is, what kind of tipping point are we at? So, has it been tipped? Did we just get tipped back? Or is there room to tip again?
Yeah.
Is the tipping still under?
Yeah.
I want to disconnect it to the questions around Barbara Jordan in terms of being a strategic idealist and having a sense of, okay, every advance is going to get a pushback, and then you have to push back against the pushback, and it's an ongoing game. And yeah, I guess that's a lot of different things, but it just seems not so different from what you're describing in terms of the.
Yeah. I mean, I think, look, so I think in the 70s, right, there's an understanding that the Black freedom struggle is still in the streets, but moving into the state house now, right? So you read other interviews with Black elected officials at that time. They, like her, they're not just politicians. I mean, they're absolutely inspired by the civil rights and Black Power movement, and they are feeling their way, right? Like, what are the levers here? Like, how can we make these institutions work for our benefit? And they absolutely, just like the parallel I see is like with the first Reconstruction, right? They see the importance of federal power for protecting the rights of minorities. And Frederick Douglass famously said, about the Republican Party is the ship, all else is the sea, right? So they felt that way about the Democrats, right? You might not like it, and there's a lot of people we don't like, but it's our ship, and it's what we got, and we got to get on this ship and try and move it as best we can. I think she would be absolutely dispirited at so many things. I mean, everything about the current the president-elect, and because he really does symbolize a different way of thinking about federal power, which is to limit, put in constraints and foreign policy, all the things about coalitions, even in foreign policy, she would have gone along with. But it's really an attack, on the kinds of policies that she would have seen as necessary, right, to protect minority rights and the rights of women. I mean, Jordan was a very strong feminist. She supported the Equal Rights Amendment. She supported abortion rights. I have, she's tells the women in Denton in the women's college there in 1970 that they're all brainwashed. she said, "You guys all been brainwashed." She said, "You all got to get into politics." And she uses the word brain. It's kind of funny. She uses the word brainwashed. She said the Southern man has done this to women. And I wasn't expecting that, because normally, her feminism is not something that is talked about a lot. But it's there. It's there in all throughout. And the desire to lead an independent, like all those things that we value, making decisions about your body, how she wanted to make her own decisions about her health, her sexuality, her rights as an individual to live life as a free person, I think is extremely important to her, is essential to her being. And you see, it's not something that everyone agreed with, right? But it's that's partly why I think she was so courageous. I think the parallels are there, the ones that you talked about, very much so.
We have time for one last question. Hanan?
Thank you so much for a fantastic presentation. I'm wondering if she made any open comments, or she related to the Black Panther, or she made any comments about the violence that this important movement faced, and though it was crushed.
Which movement?
The Black Panther.
Oh.
And also if she had some interest particularly in uplifting poor communities.
Sorry, what communities?
The poor communities, particularly among the Black.
Oh, yes. Well, she's, so I'll take the second part of that first. I mean, she's from the Fifth Ward, right? And so she is very much tied with those institutions. She makes a special point, for example, to bring Fifth Ward children, to the state capitol when she's there. And she knows this is her base. These women are her base. They're her voters. And she does, after two things. Does she bring federal money into Houston? Yes, she does. And after she is no longer in Congress, she becomes on the board. There's something called like a Community Reinvestment Act, which doesn't actually require banks to invest in poor communities, but strongly encourages them to, and sort of gives a kind of lever for people who want that to happen. She served on the board of Texas Bank, and forced them to open up branches in the Fifth Ward on Lyons Avenue. There's really interesting testimony or oral history of other women who were involved in those efforts, for the banks to invest in poor areas and neighborhoods. That hasn't been talked about a lot. So I think this is evidence of her ongoing, attempts, right, to try and reinvigorate this area, but she can't do everything. I mean, it's obviously still, the businessmen of Houston are not so interested in this. And you can see this from the war on poverty, and which I talk about. Now, your other question about, what was the Black Panther. Yes, there's a lot of, she gives an interview where she talks very approvingly of people like Malcolm X, Eldridge Cleaver. She said, oh, these men are really important in helping people think differently about themselves, and they gave us permission to voice anger and to feel anger. So she's quite, I think her relationship with the Black Power movement, she'll say, it's not my way, right? That's not how I want to do things. I prefer to work this way, but I can appreciate what they bring. And I think going to Gary was so interesting. I did not expect that, to going to that National Black Political Conference and actually serving. And then what happens is that the Black politicians just kind of get the rug taken out from them, and Amiri Baraka takes over, and he calls them all bourgeois, and it's an interesting moment where you really are, the activists and the politicians are really trying to see if they can create some common ground. She never denounces Black Power, and in fact, what I've found is that her saying very positive things about it in interviews. So.
Join me in thanking Dr. Curtin.
Thank you.
I need to do my closing spiel. I hope you were as inspired as I was by these lovely remarks. And if you enjoyed hearing about Dr. Curtin's latest book, you will certainly want to check out our spring programming in Center for Public History, which will include the screening of a documentary film about Liz Carpenter, who worked for the Lyndon Johnson administration and who was also a key player in the National Women's Conference. That event will be in March of 2025, and we have many more events in CPH in the planning stages. So follow us on the various socials and read our emails and come to our events. At CPH, we rely on the generous support of people like you who are committed to keeping Houston's history alive and supporting student success. If you enjoyed today's program, you can support us by visiting the website www.houstonhistorymagazine.org, and there are various ways to donate from there. I would like to thank the people who made tonight happen. Our CPH program director, Dr. Wes Jackson, our project manager, Dr. Sandra Davidson, our graduate assistant, Daniel Killian, the amazing folks at UH Streaming Media who are recording this. I kind of wish they weren't recording this part, but yes, thank you guys. And thank you to our Reach interns who have welcomed people in and done an amazing job. Biggest thanks of all are to Dr. Curtin for giving us the reason for being here tonight. Buy her book, read her book, stay active, be strategic, and be inspired. Thank you for coming. And one last thing that I forgot to say earlier, if you are here for Dr. Harwell's class, there's a sign-up sheet in the back. So thank you.